So it has been a couple weeks for us studying the Gospel of Luke. And to refresh your memory, at this point, Jesus, he is in the northern part of Israel, a place called Galilee. And what I love about Jesus is wherever he's going, he's sharing the good news. It didn't matter if he was in a house or a synagogue, at the beach or in a boat, or walking alongside of a lake. Wherever he's going, the world was his classroom. And he's sharing, he's loving, he's inviting people into the kingdom. And that's what we're going to see today. Jesus continuing to love and to serve people. And we read now in verse 27, it says, "After this, Jesus went out and he saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. 'Follow me,' Jesus said to him. And Levi got up and he left everything and he followed him." So check this out. We see here that Jesus, as he's walking, as he's looking for opportunities to love, he comes to a tax collector's booth and he meets a guy named Levi. Now, Bible scholars tell us that Levi is none other than Matthew. And we read here that his job was to collect taxes. Now, one of the things we need to know about tax collectors is that they were some of the most despised and hated people in the ancient world. The Jewish people had zero respect for them. In fact, if you look in the Mishnah, which is the Jewish commentary on the law, the Mishnah puts tax collectors in the same category as murderers and highway robbers. So these people are really not respected, not loved. The Pharisees, they called them beasts in human shape. They were excluded from every form of Jewish social life. They weren't allowed to be a witness in court. They weren't allowed to set foot inside synagogues. And if a tax collector entered your house, that house was considered to be ceremonially unclean. If you had a relative or a friend who was a tax collector, that would bring this whole wave of social stigma upon you as well, and disgrace upon your entire household. Now, why is it that these people were so hated? Well, the short answer is that they worked for the Roman government. As we've talked about going through the Gospel of Luke, Rome at that time ruled the world. Their kingdom expanded all throughout much of the Mediterranean, including Israel. And what the Romans did in order to raise money for their empire and for their military projects is they would set up these tax collector booths at strategic points all throughout Israel. And by law, tax collectors could stop you at any time and they could demand of you payment. But here's the catch. Rome would ask for a certain percentage of that, but by law, they were allowed to keep as much as they wanted on top of that. So this is a system that favors greed and corruption. Basically, the greedier you were as a tax collector, the richer you could become. So you could imagine now why the people absolutely despise tax collectors. I mean, let's just say worst case scenario, right? Canada decides to invade. The day finally comes, right? And they attack and invade America, and they set up their military checkpoints throughout our nation. And if you're from Canada, forgive me. My mom's Canadian, so no big deal. But let's say you're going around, downtown Raleigh or something. By law, they could stop you. So a Canadian stops you in the street. "Hey, I'm a tax collector. Is that a cup of coffee you have in your hand, eh?" And you're like, "Yeah." He's like, "Okay, I'm gonna tax you for that. And is that a new book that you just picked up?" "Yep." "Okay, I'll tax you for that. And that shirt that you just bought?" "Okay, I'll tax you for that." By law, they could tax you for everything or anything that you had at that time. So it wouldn't be long before you're starting to burn flags of Canada in your lawn, right? Pretty soon you're gonna be hating that nation and hating people from that nation. That's what's happening here. The Romans, they despise the Jews. The Jews despise the Romans. They're putting this heavy burden financially upon them. And so, if that's the case, you would imagine that Jesus, right, he's starting his earthly ministry. And if you're beginning this new movement, if you're trying to gather around you a team of people who you know is going to go out and impact the world and turn it upside down, well, what are the kinds of people that you want on your team? Well, you want people who are godly and respected. I mean, the last thing you want is a group of people that everyone in your community hates, right? This seems like a way to torpedo this new movement. And yet, one of the things we're going to see over and over again is that Jesus, his kingdom mindset was so counterintuitive that he goes after the people that everyone else rejected and despised, and he invites them to be a part of what he's doing in the world. And if I could just say this as a side note, how many times in our life do we look past the Levites? How many times do we ignore the people, or we think, well, they're not ready yet, or they're not mature enough yet, or they don't fit into my category of what I think a follower of Christ should look like, or whatever. And so often we have a perception of people, and we fail to see them in their potential. Everyone else saw a Levi. Everyone else saw a tax collector. But Jesus, he saw a Matthew. He saw a writer of a gospel. He saw a man who could turn the world upside down. Everyone saw a David, a shepherd boy. But God looked and saw a man who would kill Goliath, a man who would lead a nation. Everyone else saw Saul, a persecutor of Christians. But Jesus saw a Paul, one who would be the tip of the spear for this Christian movement in the first century. And if I could just say this, that we need to be a group of people who see others in their potential. That we need to pray for this kind of kingdom perspective, not to pigeonhole people or think we've got people figured out, but to see them in what God can do in and through them, to invest in them, to serve them, to love them. That's what Jesus does here. He goes to someone that everyone rejected, that everyone despised. He says, hey, you, Levi, come and follow after me. Now, check out what happens, verse 29. Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house. And a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, if you're a Pharisee, this story has just gone from really bad to incredibly much worse. Because it was bad enough that Jesus would call a tax collector to be one of his disciples. I mean, this in and of itself is a scandal. They're at this point lighting up Twitter. They're posting things on their blog. Have you heard about Jesus? Can you believe the kinds of people that he's inviting to follow after him? I mean, this was scandalous enough. But Jesus takes it to a whole new level. Because it says here that he then goes to the house of Levi, and he has a great banquet, and a large crowd of tax collectors and sinners were eating with them. Now, here in the West, we read this and we think, oh, big deal, so what? He went to someone's house to eat. I mean, we'll go to restaurants and we don't really think too much about who's around us or who's at the table eating with us. It's not that big a deal. You know, we casually dine with all different kinds of people. But in the ancient world, who you ate with was so significant. Who you ate with said all kinds of things about who you were, your character, your personality, your trajectory. Who you ate with, well, this built a bridge of friendship to those people, and you're making a statement to everyone else. Look, this is my tribe. These are my people. These are the kinds of individuals that I want to be associated with. So to sit down and have a dinner with someone was very significant indeed. In fact, there's this Bible scholar named Scott Barchi. He said, meal times were far more than occasions for individuals to consume nourishment. Being welcomed at a table for the purpose of eating food with another person had become a ceremony richly symbolic of friendship, intimacy, and unity. So he says, when you sit down and eat with someone, you are, in a sense, unifying yourself with that individual. In the ancient world, this was a form of intimacy and friendship. You are identifying yourself with that tribe. Now, again, here in the West, that's hard for us to understand. But if you've done much travel, there are parts of the world where this is still very much the case. Last week for our Easter service, I shared a story about my time as a missionary in a place called Vanuatu. And we were there for 3 years. And one of the things that I loved about our time that was so fascinating is that we got to go to these tribes and villages where they literally had never heard the gospel before. In fact, this one village, it took several days to get there. And when we arrived, it turns out I was the very first foreigner to ever step foot inside this village. And the response, the reaction of the people was fascinating. The adults of the village ran in terror, and the kids of the village, they actually were curious. They weren't afraid at all. In fact, this one kid, he kind of walks up to me and he's like touching my skin, like, are you real? Like, what is this strange creature that has wandered in? And to be honest with you, as we're waiting to see what was going to happen, I was a little nervous because the last reported case of cannibalism took place in Vanuatu. And I had no idea, like, what are they going to come out of the jungle with spears in their hand? Are they going to try and eat me? If so, should I give them the cold shoulder, which is a horrible cannibal joke? And so, I'm waiting this out, and finally, the chief of the village comes out. And this was a big deal. And he approaches me, and he invites me to come to a feast. And in that culture, they called it a laffit, which is it's a great term. You must come to my laffit, he said. Okay, I'll come. And so this was a huge deal because in that culture, who you eat with said everything. So if you're eating with another village, that was the equivalent of building a pact with that village. That's a way of saying, your people are my people. If you're attacked, we'll defend you. If we're attacked, you'll come to our aid. We are one. So by inviting us to the Laffit, this was huge. And so they took all day. They're preparing this. They get out these big banana leaves and island potato and kill the fatted pig in this case. And there's a sense of buzz and excitement. And they got the fire going in this big hut where we're going to go and meet and sit on the ground and eat together. And as we're getting ready for this, our guide who took us to this village, he was a local guy, and he could speak Vanuatu language and also their tribal language, which was totally separate from the language we had learned. And he told me, he said, now, Dominic, you need to know that at this feast, whatever the chief gives you to eat, you have to eat it. Like, you simply cannot deny. If you say no, like, this is a big deal. Maybe they will eat you or something, right? So you have to eat it. Now, immediately, I'm getting really nervous because I had already eaten all kinds of weird stuff in my 3 years in Vanuatu. Like, we had had worms, we'd had live fish, we had had bat, which is like the worst thing I've ever had. Daniel speaks of the abomination that causes desolation. That's actually a fulfillment of that prophecy. It was so disgusting. And so I'm thinking, oh no, and I'm already praying, God, please pray that nothing weird's going to happen. And so we're sitting there and in this big circle, and the chief comes out and he's dressed in all these fancy colors, and they're all in their island costumes and all that. And he gives some speech, and then he says, now I want to welcome this team from America. And he says, to welcome us into our village, he says, we want to invite you to drink of the cup of kava. Now, no sooner did he say that, than the floor just gave out under me. Because oh man, this is, of all the scenarios, of all the things that we could possibly eat or drink, This was the worst. You see, what they did was we'd sit in this big corner or this big circle, and he'd take this half cup of kind of a half coconut shell, and they would take kava root. Now, some of you may have heard of kava plants. You can actually buy it in Whole Foods now. But it comes from the South Pacific. It's this root that when you chew on it, it's supposed to like make you kind of intoxicated, give you a buzz. Some of you are like, wow, I'm going to Whole Foods right after this. No. And it's supposed to like relax you. Like people take it to help them sleep at night or whatever. And so in that culture, kava is a really, really big deal. And so what they do, now if you knew how they made it, you probably wouldn't go out and buy some, because they take this kava root and one by one they'll chew it up and then they spit it into this bowl. And so the chief begins, chews it up, spits it in the bowl, hands it to the next guy, he chews, spits, and it goes all the way around, and then they bring it to me. I'm praying like I've never prayed before. I'm like, Lord, there's some lines I just can't cross. Like, I'll go to the ends of the earth for you, I'll serve you, whatever. But I don't know if I can do this. This is too much. And I'm just sitting there in a cold sweat. And our guide, bless his heart, he steps in and he grabs the bowl. He must have seen, what a hard time I was having with this. And all eyes are on me, right? And he takes the bowl of kava, he holds it up Mufasa style, and he's like, on behalf of Dominic and the entire team, we want to thank you for welcoming us to this village, and I will drink this bowl of kava on behalf of all of them. He drank the whole thing. And here's the weird thing. He liked it. He actually asked for more. He's like, do you have any more of this? This is great. You see, in this Vanuatu culture, eating and drinking, this is so important. It's so huge. It says everything. And that's what's going on here. Jesus, by eating and drinking with these people, he's saying, this is my tribe. These are my peeps, right? These are the people I want to be associated with. And it's for that reason, verse 30, the Pharisees are furious. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? What is he doing with those people? Doesn't he know who they are? And more importantly, what does that say about who he is? So they are completely scandalized by what Jesus is doing. Now, look at Jesus' response, verse 31. Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Oh, what an incredible thing Jesus just said. Bible scholars, they talk about this verse, especially those who are experts on the Gospel of Luke. And there are several that say that this verse, Luke 6 or 5:31, is actually Jesus' mission statement for the entire Gospel of Luke. That this verse serves to set Jesus' trajectory for his entire mission. From this point onwards, we're going to see that everything that Jesus does flows out of this statement. He says, look, the kinds of people that I have come for are not for those who think they have it all together. It's not for the religious or the churchy or those who think that their relationship with God is spot on. No, he says, I have come for the weary, the weak, the broken. I have come for prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners. I've come for those that society has pushed to the margins, the people that the religious want nothing to do with. I'm going after those that you can't stand to be around. The Pharisees would actually, when they saw a tax collector, they would spit on the ground as a sign of disrespect. Jesus is saying, I'm going to those people that you would spit on. I'm going to those people you want nothing to do with. This is what I'm all about. Like a doctor coming to the sick, I have come to those who are sick as well. And brothers and sisters, I am so glad that that is the heart of our God. And none of us would be here today if Jesus had not pursued us when we were at our worst. If Jesus had not come after us when we were the weak and weary and wounded. And this is our story. We all have a past. We all have guilt from what we've done. We all know where we've been apart from Christ. And yet when we were at our worst, Romans says, while we were sinners, Christ died for us. That's when he pursued us. That's when he loved us. That's when he welcomed us into his kingdom. We were the sick ones, and the doctor pursued us and healed us by his grace. So Jesus responds to their accusation, and he says, this is my mission. This is what I'm all about. Well, they said to him, verse 32, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so did the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours go on eating and drinking. And Jesus answered, can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and in those days they will fast. And he told them this parable. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the new wine will burst the skins, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better. Now, this is really interesting. The Pharisees, they're looking for an opportunity to drag Jesus down. They're trying to accuse him of all kinds of things here. And the first accusation is, Jesus, you're eating with the wrong kinds of people. When that accusation went nowhere, their response, number two, is to attack him for the amount of food that he's eating. They say, look, John's disciples fast, we fast, but why is it, Jesus, that you and your disciples aren't fasting? Now, we have to understand that in Jewish religious culture of the first century, fasting was a really, really big deal. This was a huge part of what they thought defined them as spiritual. The Pharisees actually had a rhythm of fasting twice a week, usually on Monday and Thursday. Those were their fasting days. And when they fasted, they really made it obvious to everyone else that they were fasting. They would intentionally, on those days, they wouldn't wash their face. They wouldn't comb their hair. They would walk through town in kind of a shuffle and their heads hanging down low, really depressed. And everyone else in the community would look on at those Pharisees and say, wow, they're so spiritual. Look how miserable they are. They must be fasting. Wow, this is incredible, right? And for them, you see, for these Pharisees, the way that they looked at food, their theology of food, if you would, was that food was a boundary marker. Food was a way of saying who's in and who's out. Food was a way of magnifying their separateness and their holiness from everyone else. But when Jesus came, he flipped all that around. Jesus never uses food to exclude people, but rather he uses it to draw people in to the kingdom of God. For Jesus, the abundance of food and abundance of grace were inexorably linked. For Jesus, food was a tangible way to experience the goodness and the generosity of God. The Pharisees could not understand that. They're angry with him. Jesus, first of all, you're eating, when you eat, it's with the wrong kinds of people. And secondly, you're eating way too much than we feel comfortable with. If you're a truly religious, holy man, you should be following the same religious practices that we are. Now, check out how Jesus responds to their attack. If you're a note taker this morning, or if you have one of those iPhone note app thingies, you can jot these things down if you wish. 3 different analogies. It's so brilliant as Jesus crafts his response to their attack. First of all, he talks about a wedding in verses 34 through 35. Secondly, fabric, verse 36. And thirdly, wine, verses 37 through 39. Now, first of all, let's talk about the wedding. Jesus says, look, if you're at a wedding, that's not a time to fast, right? A wedding is a time for celebration. It's a time for joy. It's a time to step into this larger picture of a couple being united before God and others, and you all celebrate in that process. We have an engaged couple that's among us. Most of you know this already, but Cody, who's back there with our slides, and Julianne is somewhere in here. But they're getting married, September 21st? And which, by the way, is why I'm not a cessationist, because I know that miracles can happen. Cody is getting married. God's kingdom is present in his life. And now, I can't wait for that wedding. It's going to be awesome. If you showed up at Cody and Julianne's wedding, and let's just say that you, instead of rejoicing and you're just excited for what's happening, let's say that you just show up and you're dressed in gothic clothes that day, right? And you're listening to Depeche Mode on your headset, and you're just angry and upset, and you're not talking to anyone. Like, how is that gonna go down? Right? At a wedding, hey, this is a time to step into joy. It's a time to eat and drink to what God is doing in their life, right? So too, Jesus is saying, look, I am here. I am the bridegroom. I have come to invite my bride into the kingdom. This is a time to eat and drink to what God is up to. This is a time of celebration and joy. And you Pharisees, you don't understand that. You think it's just about your rules and your regulations and using food as this exclusive means, but I'm seeing it as a means to an end, to welcome, love, and to serve. And then he talks about fabric and wine. Verse 36, if you put a new patch on an old garment, he says, when you wash it, it will pull away and tear the fabric. And then verse 37, if you put new wine into old wineskins, it will break the wineskins and ruin the wine. You see, old wineskins are rigid. They're inflexible. And because of that, they break easily, right? New wineskins, however, they grow, they expand with the fermenting wine. What is Jesus saying here? What's the point that he's making in those 2 points? Well, he's telling the Pharisees, what I'm doing is so much more different than anything that you're used to. What I'm up to, what my kingdom is all about, is it's explosive, it's vibrant, it's creative, it's new and fresh, it's bursting with life. It's like new wine in a new wineskin. And the kinds of people that I have called to be a part of this kingdom project are those that you have rejected. It's the people you exclude by your religion. I'm inviting sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors, the broken, the lepers, the weary. And when you look at the Gospels, those are the people that came by the thousands. We're going to see in a chapter or so that when Jesus gave Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, the people that he was talking to was thousands and thousands potentially of these kinds of people. The downcast, those that society had pushed to the margins. Jesus says, this is what my kingdom is about. Now, this is what to me is so fascinating. What was Jesus' evangelism strategy when it came to reaching these kinds of people? How did Jesus go out and draw them in? How did he share the gospel with them? Now, as a pastor and someone who's been around the church for years and years, kind of the default answer that I want to say is, oh, okay, evangelism, well, for Jesus, that must have been he's inviting them to a Bible study, or he's handing out tracts, or he's going through the Romans road, right? He's memorizing these verses, or he's asking poignant questions of them in order to bring them to a fuller understanding of the gospel. And it, for me at least, so often is about bringing them into some building or some structure or some place. But what honestly scandalizes me about Jesus, and what flips my preconceptions, my religious preconceptions upside down, is that for Jesus, the way that he evangelized was less of this handing out of tracts and taking people through scripture, although he would obviously talk about the gospel. But his primary means of evangelism, well, very simply, was to eat, to share meals with those who were hurting. And not just to eat, but to eat a lot. In fact, in Luke chapter 7, we'll see this in a few weeks. The Pharisees accused Jesus of being a glutton. Jesus, you eat too much. This isn't right. And Jesus' response was basically, yeah, you're right. That's what I do, right? I eat. And I invite people to do that. For Jesus, food was a sign of God's great welcome. It was a way of proclaiming and demonstrating the good news. I mean, again, we need to understand that for Jesus, when it talks about eating in the Gospels, this isn't some quick half-hour Chinese takeout kind of thing. Eating in the ancient world was a really big deal, and it took hours. Just like my Vanuatu story, you would go over to someone's house, you would relax, you would talk, you would share stories, you'd put your feet up, you would break bread, you would eat fish and drink wine, you would talk late into the night. And the whole time that this is happening, as Jesus is with these people, he's loving and sharing and talking about the kingdom. And people then are responding, and they're opening up their hearts and lives to his love. Again, there's a sense of marked authenticity about this. This isn't some rigid paradigm that Jesus is following. Rather, it's very relational, it's very personal. Jesus is looking for ways to get into their life, not as a means to an end, but because he cared so much about those people. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Dom, aren't you reading a little too much in the text? I mean, sure, right here it talks about Jesus eating and drinking with sinners, but that's just right here in Luke 5. I mean, do we really see that in other parts of the gospel? Absolutely. In fact, all throughout this book, over and over again, that's what we're going to see Jesus doing. One Bible scholar said this. He said, virtually every time you see Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, he's either at a meal, going to a meal, or leaving a meal. And this is just how Jesus loved people. When you look at the way that Jesus taught and the parables that Jesus told, in many ways, it centered around food. Again, you can jot these things down if you like to take notes. Luke 22, verse 30. Eat and drink at my table in the kingdom. Matthew 8:11. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and they will take their places at the feast in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 22:2. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a feast for his son. What's the last thing that Jesus did before dying on a cross? He shared a meal with his disciples in the upper room. One of the first things that Jesus did after Easter, resurrection, Luke chapter 21, one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. Come, let's have breakfast. To which I say, amen. C.S. Lewis, he said this, he that looketh on a plate of ham and eggs to lust after it hath already committed breakfast in his heart. Ha! Guilty as charged, right? In the book of Acts, this was the evangelism strategy of the early church. Acts 2:42, they devoted themselves to the word, to prayer, to fellowship, and to eating, the breaking of bread. When the gospel first went out to the Gentiles, God used a vision of food to motivate Peter and to get that whole process started. Remember there in Acts how Peter, he was waiting for lunch, and then God brings him this great vision. It says that this blanket or this sheet came down from heaven that had unclean animals on it, pigs and other things, and it lowers before Peter, and God says, arise, kill, and eat. First mention of pigs in a blanket in history, right there, it's biblical, Acts 10. Right? God uses a vision of food to motivate Peter, to teach Peter a lesson about how the kingdom of God is for all people. When you skip ahead to the book of Revelation, how does the Bible end? At a meal, the wedding supper of the Lamb, God's people eating and drinking together. One author, he said this: if you can read the New Testament without getting hungry, then you're not paying any attention. You see, for Jesus, this was the way that he loved and served and evangelized. And I simply want to make this point today. The same thing holds true of us. When we talk about evangelism, or when we use the language of living on mission, serving our community, telling others the good news of Jesus. So for many of us, that can be intimidating language because we have these churchy, boxy parameters of what evangelism looks like. And the fact of the matter is, we can't all teach like a Brian Martz, or we can't all lead worship like a Tony Pallotta, or we can't write books like Ryan Pemberton, who's writing a book on C.S. Lewis right now. The fact is that for most of us, we can't do stuff like that or evangelize like a Greg Laurie. But the fact of the matter is, what we all can do is what Jesus is doing here. We can invite people into our homes. We can sit around a table. We can eat and drink together. We can talk about the kingdom. We can open up our hearts. We can open up our lives. We can build relationships. I mean, this is so simple. And it's not only simple, but if you're a foodie, this is a lot of fun, right? I mean, this is something that we all enjoy doing. Eating's a huge part of our life. Do you know that the average American, this is true, eats 2,000 pounds, that's a ton of food, every year. And when you break that down to a lifetime, that's 2,500 chickens, 20 pigs, and 12 cows. And if you live in Chapel Hill, like 30,000 pounds of kale, right? It's interesting. This is a huge part of our life. And why not? The story is telling us, why not take that part of your life that you do all the time, 21 times a week, 3 times a day, minimum, for some of us it's more, right? And why not invite other people into that? Why not use that as an opportunity to share the good news? This is so simple, and yet honestly, it is so revolutionary. I haven't heard messages like this. In fact, for years, I've kind of glossed over this whole thing of Jesus connecting with people in that way. Because again, I've always had a very boxy religious view on what evangelism is. I've shared a little bit about my story over the last few months. I wasn't raised in a Christian home, but once our family became saved, I was in junior high at the time, and we started going to this church. Wonderful church, great church. This isn't a critique on the church, but for many of you, this may be your story. This church started giving evangelism seminars, and I'm all for that. I think that's great. Only the way that it was done was honestly so formulaic. It was so religious and boxy. We showed up, and I'm there. I'm like 12 years old, and I'm taking notes, and they come out and they say, okay, this is how you evangelize. First of all, it's once a week, right? Friday nights at 7 o'clock, we all meet up and we go out on the streets, and this is how you're to do it. You're to start with this question: what would you do if you died tonight? Which is kind of a conversation killer right there, I found, right? So you ask that question, and then if they respond in a certain way, then you follow this certain path of, okay, well, you know, share this verse with them, and then take them to that scripture, and then you're to ask them this question, right? And there's all these acronyms and all these points that begin with the letter P, and there's this whole process you're supposed to take them through till finally you say the religious, prayer at the end with them, and they become a follower of Jesus at that point. Now, granted, obviously that can work, and sure enough, we'd go out on the streets. In some cases that would work, but to be honest with you, in most cases, it was a huge turnoff for a lot of people. In fact, at this seminar, they had this guy come out, true story, dressed up like a giant bear. He was dressed as a bear, literally. And he said, "Hey, my name is Evangel, the Good News Bear, and I'm here to tell you how to evangelize. And write it down, brothers and sisters. B stands for Bible, and E stands for Evangel, and A stands for," and we're writing all this down. Okay, great. Will you be there with us Friday night? Because people sure will get saved if you're with us, right? And it was just so honestly cheesy, it really was. And we'd go out and we'd hand out these tracts and talk to these people. Now again, I want to be careful not to beat up too much on that, because the Lord can use anything and any process. But to be honest, when I look at Jesus, when I study the Gospels, I've checked in the Greek, I don't see Evangel, the Good News Bear here. I've looked for him. He's not there. And what I do see is Jesus hanging out with people. I see Jesus sitting around tables, and laughing and talking and eating and drinking and sharing and loving and serving. I don't see so much Jesus handing out tracts. Where are you going to go when you die tonight? But I do see Jesus invited over to the house of a tax collector, a sinner, a prostitute. This is scandalous to the religious mind. This is so different from how so many of us were trained to think. Check out this epic quote. It's by a guy named Simon Carey Holt. He's a theologian and a chef, which is a great combination. He knows how to cook up some great meals and great Bible studies. He says this: "It's good to be reminded that the table is a very ordinary place. A place so routine and everyday that it's easily overlooked as a place of ministry." Now that's interesting. And this business of hospitality that lies at the heart of Christian mission, it's a very ordinary thing. It's not rocket science, nor is it terribly glamorous, yet it is the very ordinariness of the table and of the Christian and of the ministry that we exercise there that renders these elements of Christian life so important. At base, hospitality is about providing a space for God's Spirit to move. Setting a table, cooking a meal, washing the dishes is the ministry of facilitation, providing a context in which people feel loved and welcomed, and where God's Spirit can be at work in their lives. Hospitality is a very ordinary business, but in its ordinariness is its real worth. Whatever it looks like, your own table is a sacred space. Isn't that an awesome quote? Your table is sacred space. It's holy ground. That's what it was for Jesus. And that's what it can be for us too. So I want to close just by simply asking two probing questions. The first one is this: is there anyone in your life that Jesus is calling you to share a meal with? Or if I could put it this way, who are the quote unquote tax collectors and the sinners of your neighborhood? If Jesus worked at your office, who would he be taking out to lunch this week? Is there someone in your life right now where the Spirit, even now, is putting on your heart, look, you need to get with them. You need to share with them. You need to listen to them. You need to love them. There's this wonderful story in the book of 2 Kings. We don't have time to go there today, but just write it down, 2 Kings 7. And it tells a story of these 4 lepers that were in a starving city. And it says there that they were dying. They're starving to death, probably days away, if not hours away from death. And one of the lepers is like, you know what, we need to go get some food. Let's go see the enemy. There's no food here, So let's go ask the enemy. And if they kill us, no biggie, we're going to die anyway. But if they give us food, then praise God, we'll have something to eat. And so they go to the camp of the enemy. And if you read that story, you know what happens. They get there, and it says God had spooked the army. They fled and left, and they left behind tents that were filled with food. And these four lepers, this was like their dream come true. It was the ultimate downtown food truck rodeo experience. Tent after tent, packed with food, Mexican and crepes and southern fried chicken. Like they're just going from tent to tent, gorging themselves. And I imagine these guys expanding, right? Getting larger and larger, feasting. And finally, one of the lepers is like, wait, hold on. What are we doing? This is a day of good news. And here we are eating and enjoying all of this food, but there's a city. There's a group of people who are starving. We need to invite them into this. Brothers and sisters, there's a city that's starving spiritually. There are people who are desperate to hear the good news. In Cary, in Holly Springs, in Fuquay, in Durham, in Chapel Hill, in Raleigh. There's a city that's filled with those who are seeking and confused and lost and broken, tax collectors and sinners and the weak and the broken, those that church people often exclude. And those are the people that we have the opportunity to love and to serve and to break bread and drink wine and to share and to invite them into this kingdom project. Is there someone in your life this week that you can do that with? The second question, and I think more personal for us today, is that have you personally allowed Jesus to love you in this way? Jesus wants to have the kind of relationship with you where it's not religious and boxy or long distance or once a week. Jesus wants to have the kind of relationship with you where there's intimacy and closeness and vibrancy and connection, where you're pouring your heart into him and he's pouring his heart into you, where you truly know him, not just know about him. In the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 20, Jesus says, I stand at the door and knock. And if you open up your heart, I will come in and do what? I'll eat with you. There it is, Jesus eating again, right? Jesus loves to eat. He says, just open up your heart. Let me dine with you. Let me eat with you. Let me serve you. Let me heal you. And it could be that there are some here today and you don't have that kind of relationship with the Lord. Maybe you've never put your trust in Jesus before. Today, Jesus wants to have dinner with you. Maybe there are others here and you've gotten caught up in some cycle of addiction or sin that's controlling your life. The way you fit into this text is you are the quote-unquote sinner. You're the one that's struggling and hurting. You're the sick and you need a doctor. Today, Jesus invites you to his table. He invites you to be restored. He wants you to be a part of his kingdom. Maybe for others, you've got something in your past that's haunting you. Something that maybe honestly you're angry with God because it happened. Something that someone did to you or some way that you've been hurt or wounded in the past. Today, Jesus invites you to lay that down, to break bread, to drink wine, and to be set free. Maybe for others, you've been hurt by the church. Maybe that's your story. And you've seen hypocrisy. You've seen people do things in a quote-unquote religious way that's nothing short of wounding others and stabbing people in the back. Maybe you've been stabbed in the back by the church. Today, Jesus invites you to know him, to his table, to be set free from that stuff and into a broader context of his kingdom. He loves us so much. And as proof of that love, he says to us today, come to my table. Eat and drink of me. That's what we're going to do in a minute. As we come to the table of communion, he says that this bread is my body that was broken for you. This cup is my blood that was shed for you. Drink, eat. Do this often in remembrance of me. And just like these sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes, just like the weary and the sick and the broken, they were restored when they came to him. And we are restored as well when we come to eat and drink of his table. Let's stand, shall we?